welcome again to the Cipher Brief. I'm Tom Nagorski, and welcome to a special conversation about the war in Ukraine. And I say special not only because of everything that's going on there, but as some of you know, frequent visitors to our site, last month, the Cipher Brief traveled to Ukraine with a delegation of national security and intelligence experts from our own Cipher Brief expert family. The group held meetings with top officials in Ukraine from the government, the military, the intelligence agencies, and the private sector. And today we have three members of that delegation, Cipher Brief delegation, with us. All are former U.S. intelligence officers, and we're going to talk about the visit. But given that it was last month and we're already in mid-May now, we also want to talk about various developments that have happened since in Ukraine, because there have been many of those. I think most of you know our guests, or you can learn more about them at our site, but really briefly, we have Glenn Korn with us, former senior executive of the CIA, who worked for 34 years in U.S. intelligence, defense, and foreign affairs communities, roughly half that time in overseas posts. Glenn also served as the president's senior representative on intelligence and security issues. Ralph Goff, 35-year veteran of the CIA, where he was a six-time chief of station with extensive service in Europe, the Middle East,
Thank you, though.
and Central and South Asia. And this would be a good moment, if you heard that little bit of sound, to note that Ralph is outside somewhere, and we're very grateful to have him, but there may be an occasional moment like that one, no worries. And Paul Kolbe, former director of the Intelligence Project at Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Paul was also a longtime CIA officer, a member of the Senior Intelligence Service, serving in a half dozen countries, including in Russia. And although this is a conversation about Ukraine, it's in Russia that we begin. And actually, a reminder, but some of you seem to know already, that you can put questions for us and for the panel in the chat box. One has already come in from Robert Tonsig, and it's something we were going to ask off the bat anyway, which is, I guess you'd call it about the shakeup in the Kremlin. Robert asks about the recent rotation, Belousov for Shoigu. What we're talking about is the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu. We were just saying before we came on that there's been talk about his ouster for almost as long as this war has been going on. It has happened in the last 24, 48 hours. Interestingly, as Russia gets some battlefield momentum, Vladimir Putin has shown Shoigu the door, and in comes an economist, Andrei Belousov. Who wants to pick that one up? Ralph, let's go to your outdoor location. Were you surprised by the news, and what would you think are the most important things to share about it?
So I'm never surprised by anything that comes out of Moscow, and although I will admit to some surprise at the choice here. I mean, Shoigu, for one thing, it's still unclear if he's been kicked upstairs or kicked out. We'll see what happens, what they do with him in this new position with the National Security Council. In the meantime, Belousov, I mean, this is a technocrat. He's got experience with economic portfolio and with the military-industrial complex. So he's actually a good choice by Putin, very pragmatic choice. If Putin is worried about the state of the economy. You have this now, the Russian economy has been retooled to be primarily based on military production, right? But that doesn't do anything to help this civilian economy. So, you know, it appears to me that Belarus is a smart choice if you're looking to either transition the military economy over to the civilian economy, or if you're looking for a way to minimize the negative impacts of having a one-horse pony military-based economy. So, you know, this could be a sign that Putin's more worried about the economy than he is about the progress of the war right now.
Mm-hmm. Paul Kolbe, we've past commanders in Russia have, you know, you hear words like butcher attached to them, and here you have, to the extent we know his record, more of a technocrat and manager. Is that sort of your impression as well of the impact of this change?
Yeah, I think it reflects two things. One, it's acknowledgement that this is going to be a long war, right? It's not going to be one immediately on the battlefield. And second, and this is most important, that the key to this war is not necessarily on the front line right now and who's got, you know, the sort of the best tactics and it's who's got the best, strongest, fastest, most creative, innovative defense industrial base. And that's where Belousov will be particularly useful. He knows the economy. He's got Putin's trust, and he has a mandate to innovate and to try to adapt. We've already seen that the Russian army and military is an adaptive and learning organization. They're becoming much more effective in how they implement their attacks and coordinate them much better than they did certainly at the start of the war. And building Ukraine's advantage in the face of greater numbers of men and in the face of greater volume of material is to be quicker, faster, smarter, more precise. If Russia is able to get to that point where they're as quick, as fast, as precise as Ukraine, it's difficult news. So I think it puts the onus on Ukraine to do even more better in that respect.
Speaking of difficult news, it would seem in the month or so since you were all in Kyiv with this delegation, difficult news seems about the way to describe it from the Ukrainian perspective. And just recently, I guess in terms of what you might call battlefield momentum, Russia has it at the moment. I think you have to acknowledge. And Glenn Korn, maybe I can come to you. That, from our reading, there are two things going on. Maybe there are others. One is incursions and taking of some territory, not a ton, but territory doesn't move much in this war, in the Kharkiv region in the north, and also just regular pummeling, it seems, of Ukrainian infrastructure, energy in particular. How do you assess sort of the on-the-ground state of the war in these weeks since you were there? You're muted, Glenn, I think.
All right, thanks for the question. If I could jump back to the question about Shoigu, we shouldn't forget that he's not a military guy. So he's not much different than Belousov. Maybe Belousov has a different background, but Shoigu's being nominated for the Patrushev position is interesting, and we should watch what happens with Patrushev. His son was given a very good job in the government, and that tells me that Putin is moving the Jengas very carefully because he doesn't want to upset the balance of power. And my guess would be that he had an agreement with Patrushev that Patrushev would leave that spot. Going to the question about your question, Tom, the Ukrainians predicted this when we were in Kiev. Pretty much everyone we spoke to said that the Russians were preparing for offensive operations before we resolved the issue of continued aid and assistance. So we saw this coming. The Ukrainians saw it coming. It's unfortunate, but I think that they knew it was going to happen. The Russians are trying to take advantage of an opportunity before that opportunity goes away. And the bulk of the assistance in this latest package gets to the Ukrainian forces. In terms of the energy infrastructure, it is tragic what the Russians are doing. It should be a reminder to us of how they wage war. When we were there, when we met with officials from DTEC, which is the main energy provider, they told us 80% of the infrastructure had been damaged. What was of high concern, what I heard from multiple sources there, was that the Russians were now striking targets with great accuracy, which said that they have very good intelligence, probably sometimes from on the inside, which should be worrisome. And then there was a great article in the Wall Street Journal today, which talked about the fact that the Ukrainians have been unable to sustain the air defense capacity to stop the incoming attacks of weaponized drones and cruise missiles that the Russians are launching. The Russians have increased the number of attacks, and the Ukrainians have run low on ordnance to combat those attacks. And we started to see that when we were there. And I just add, I kept when you go to Ukraine, you have an air raid alarm on your phone. And I've kept it on my phone since I've come back, and it goes off now about 2 or 3 times a night minimum. And that just tells you, that's Kiev alone. I just have it for the Kiev district. And it tells you the Russians are really ramping up while they have the opportunity to inflict damage and terrorize the Ukrainian people.
Wow.
And it's unfortunate.
That's interesting, and in a weird way, a show of your solidarity, Glenn, that you've kept that on. And just to the earlier point, I guess a lot more of it is getting through, given the air defense issue. Ralph, can I come to you, because I know you stayed on in Ukraine and went to Kharkiv, and you know some folks there after the Cipher Brief trip. We know it's second largest city. A lot of kinetic activity there a couple of years ago. We haven't heard much until recently. help us to understand what you're hearing of the lay of the land there, because it sounds very ominous when you hear that a Russian offensive has begun there. I gather in the city itself, it's not quite, it hasn't really hit. But what can you tell us about, um,
Yeah.
just how consequential things are
Yeah,
there?
yeah, Tom. Yeah, it's been serious. I mean, Kharkiv was being bombed nonstop for the past months, actually. I mean, while I was there, they were getting hit during the day, they were getting hit during night, and it was all indiscriminate civilian targets. There's nothing military whatsoever. And when you drive around downtown Kharkiv, rare was a building that didn't have shattered windows, that didn't have debris. The downtown area in particular, where the government buildings were, was particularly hard hit in the opening phases of the war, right? Now you have the Russians can hit them at will already, even before the offensive, right? They were able to launch air attacks, glide bombs, drones, missiles. They seem to use the Kinjal and the Iskander missiles there a lot to hit military targets, but the rest are just indiscriminate bombing of like shopping centers, apartment buildings, hotels, nothing military in any of the targets. I visited 5 or 6 sites that have been hit. The electricity had been knocked out, the water had been knocked out, but the irony there is that Kharkiv, after World War II, during Soviet times, is known as the hero city, right? Because of the defense they put up against the Nazi onslaught. In fact, we visited battlefields outside the city that had seen, fights between the Germans and the Soviets in the 40s, and now fights between the Ukrainians and the Russians. And the
Yep.
city was very proud of how they withstood the Nazi onslaught, and they're still proud of how they're withstanding the Russian onslaught. In fact, Kharkiv city was the cleanest city I think I've seen in my life, and the 5-hour train ride from Kharkiv to Kiev was smoother, cleaner, faster, and more on time than the Acela between New York and Washington. So, it's a proud city, and they're proud of the fact that they drove the Russians back in 2022. And everyone I talk to now says if the Russians are dumb enough to attack them again, they'll drive them back. So there's a lot of bravado and hubris there, but backed up by hard experience as well. So, I tend to agree with people who think this is some sort of Russian feint to draw away Ukrainian forces from other parts of the front. And here I think there's a danger for the Russians too, that if they try to resort to maneuver warfare in an area where they can't hide behind prepared defenses, I could see the Ukrainians marshaling adequate forces using Bradleys, M1s, Leopards, and the like to really inflict pain on them. So I'm sure the Russians are aware of that, right? Their command staff has evolved along with their fighters. So I really don't see them in an all-out drive on Kharkiv anytime in the future.
Can I
Ralph,
ask you?
does it take pressure off of Belgorod?
That's a great point, Paul. I think that's part of it too. Is you had a lot of activity by these free Russian units acting totally independent of the Ukrainian forces attacking in Belgrade, and I think the Russians were looking to relieve some of the pressure there too, because that the constant reports of attacks against one of their major cities there was a real black eye for Putin and the Russian forces.
Mhm. And just for our audience, I think most know, but Belgorod on the Russian side of the border across from northern Ukraine. Ralph, not to monopolize you here, but just one more beat on this part of the front. It's tough sometimes. I mean, some pretty good media outfits, depending how they couch it, are reporting in terms of the activity outside of Kharkiv. Somebody said that Russia has taken more territory in the last, I don't know, just a short time frame than it has since the early part of the war, which makes those advances sound very, very dramatic. Others point out that when you actually add up the kilometers or even just meters, it really doesn't add up to much. So how do you understand, where should we come down on that spectrum?
Well, it's kind of like hollow bragging, I think, on the side of the Russians. I mean, they're pushing down from the Russian border into areas that were, not prepared with defenses in depth, right? It's kind of like a buffer zone. The Ukrainians kind of like will yield them that territory. Yes, it stings Ukrainian pride a little bit, but at the end of the day, lives right now are more precious than land, frankly, when you look at the manpower mismatch. So, in this case, the Russians can brag all they want, but if they try anything serious there again, I think the Ukrainians have an opportunity to inflict really heavy casualties on them. So I don't think we'll be seeing any armored columns, racing down the roads to Kharkiv anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. Let's turn now to the aid that we're about a month, actually, I think exactly a month since the House vote that just came right at the tail end of your visit to clear the pathway for the 60.8 billion. And Glenn, maybe I come back around to you with all the stuff we've just been talking about in terms of the energy infrastructure hits, stuff in the Kharkiv region. What, if any, of the incoming aid is either already helping the Ukrainians mitigate against some of this, will in the next weeks or so, or is a ways off and the Russians can just go at will as they're doing? I don't know if you can break that down in some way. Muted again, Glenn.
Right after the aid package was approved, I was at a meeting that the Ukrainian Prime Minister was here in Washington, and I spoke with some members of the delegation, and I asked, okay, I mentioned it's going to take time to get that aid to the Ukrainian forces, and they all said the same thing. The sign itself is what's most important to us. Morale-wise, it's going to be a big boost. It already is, because we know that you haven't abandoned us, which was a sense that we got when, at least I got when I was in Kiev. People were beginning to second guess our commitment and our stamina to stand with them against Putin and the Iranians and the North Koreans, and to some degree the PRC. Mm-hmm. And so it was very good that we did it. I'm very thankful that we did it. Of course, it's only, that's one battle, let's say, here in the U.S. to make sure the American people understand that it's going to last for a certain amount of time. We're going to have to make sure that Americans understand again, or continue to understand, why it's in our best interest to continue to support the Ukrainians. In terms of some of the systems, my understanding is that some of the equipment we've given them already has been helpful. And I'm sure that once the bulk of the supplies get there, it will help shore up Ukrainian defenses and maybe give the Ukrainians the ability to counterattack in some areas and take back some of the territory that they've lost. Because I think what's happening now, my own assessment is Putin's trying to get as much territory as he can before he goes to the negotiation table, and he wants to negotiate from a position of strength. Mm-hmm. My assessment too is that one reason he got rid of Patrushev is he realizes Patrushev is too hardcore to be seen by anybody in the West as someone that can be on his team when they start negotiating. We'll see whether he gives Patrushev another job or whether Patrushev goes silently into the night. But that may be a sign that he's looking to kind of tone down the image of his cabinet to some degree. That does not mean he's going to be, he's going to continue to project strength. And to do that, he wants to take as much territory as he can. And as Ralph said, it's important that the Ukrainians give up minimal territory, and hopefully our aid will allow them to maybe even take back some territory to put Putin on the back foot.
Glenn, I'll be surprised if Patrushev goes off to his dacha to grow carrots and potatoes. I mean, he is the eminence grise. He's been kind of the, the whisperer on Putin's shoulder and into his ear. I'm really interested I think that it's going to be a, ad hoc, but nonetheless significant position. I'm curious about Medvedev as the deputy. Deputy didn't get the boss's job, so it will be interesting to see what, if anything, happens to him, or if he's just used as he is as the convenient, right, if drunk lapdog spouting horrific threats.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, I think it's notable though that whereas Peskov was very clear in the announcement about Belousov and Shoigu, they did not say where Patrushev is going yet. It that shows me there's perhaps not consensus yet in those senior levels there. And so I'll be watching LinkedIn to see if Patrushev's name comes up with open to work underneath its photo. So that's what I'm hoping.
Hey, before we leave, well, if we can leave just for a moment, we can always come back to this wonderful cast of characters, and back to the question of the aid that has come in, to the extent we know about it. Paul, maybe I'll pick on you for this one. We learned actually also just in the past few weeks that a shipment of ATACMS missiles had gone before the vote, I guess somewhat surreptitiously, but at any rate, that they have reached the Ukrainians, and there have been some reports, we had a piece about this at the Cipher Brief last week, that the Ukrainians have quickly put these to good use, at least a few of them. Just for starters, can you help our audience understand why was this missile system so high on the wish list, for one thing, and what do you know about how it's been used thus far?
Open with the caveat that I'm not a weapons expert or military expert, but that said, it doesn't prevent me from opining. Look, it's a long range system, which is important, right? It can make it more difficult, in particular for Russia, to mass forces close to the front, right? So when they mass a bunch of armor and they mass a bunch of personnel, that becomes vulnerable. So, and it looks like the intelligence, from open source reporting, that the intelligence is pretty good. Just within the last week, there was a large formation of trainees that was taken out. I'm not sure if it was ATACMS or not, but it would be a signature of that kind of strike. I think that's one of the things Glenn had pointed out on the attacks coming in the Kharkiv direction. Right now, it's dismounted infantry. You're not seeing big armor formations, and the infantry, even then, they're not sort of clustered in to make attractive targets. So that will, one, make it more difficult to punch through lines and take a lot of ground. And if they do mass the forces to do that, then they become vulnerable. So the ATACMS, I think, change the Russian calculus for what and where and when they can do it. And it's a high precision system. So with high precision intelligence, makes for an effective combo.
Ralph, I see you nodding. Do you want to add to this in any way? I mean, what if you're now a Ukrainian commander and you've got these and there are more coming in, how best to leverage them?
So, I mean, the Ukrainians have proven very adept at using these weapons in the small numbers that they have them relevant to what Russia has. I think if you're a Ukrainian commander, you're looking to leverage those, but at the same time, a big problem I see are the Russian glide bombs, right? That are, these are what used to be dumb bombs that have been fitted out with kits so that they can glide and be launched, some with some precision guidance. And these things are really, I think, have made a huge tactical difference along the Ukrainian front there. And these are when they're used against the troops, not only are they effective, but they demoralize the troops that they hit. And when they're used against civilians, I mean, it's like doubling down on terror. So, this is where all the rumors about the F-16s, when are they getting there? How many? What are they going to be used? I think, the Ukrainian commanders on the ground are looking for help from the Air Force against these glide bombs. So, the ATACMS, well, that's a good way to keep the pressure on Moscow and keep them a little bit off balance. I think countering these glide bombs is a real immediate need for the Ukrainian forces.
Glenn, you want to pick up on that? I see you. Yep.
Yeah, just to reinforce what Ralph said, I mean, when we were there, the Ukrainians told us, some of our senior interlocutors, that the Russians were flying 300 to 600 tactical sorties on the front, and they really didn't have a weapon system to counter those sorties. And so it's going to be very important to help them find a solution to this problem, because they admitted it is terrorizing for the troops. There's nothing they can do to defend themselves, and we're going to have to find a solution there.
They have to take out the platforms and take out the bases.
Yeah. Air defenses, in all the discussion of necessary aid and things where there was a big Ukrainian shortfall, for the layperson among us, that's me, very easy to understand when people say there's a 10-to-1, disparity in ammunition stocks. Air defenses were often described just in a general sense that, they don't have enough and hence they're getting hit. What do you know, Glenn, about what's coming? What is in the U.S. package that will give the Ukrainians some better ability to protect, let's say, their energy infrastructure and whatever else is getting hit?
So one thing that the Ukrainians stressed to us is that the limited systems they have been focused on trying to defend the critical infrastructure and the civilian population. And sadly, we know that the Russians have specifically targeted the civilian population of Ukraine. And they've had to make a very difficult choice to protect the civilian population instead of the troops on the front line in many cases. I don't know the details of everything we're giving. My understanding is we've approved maybe an additional Patriot battery or more, which would be great. I know the Ukrainians are looking for that. I'm sure that the ammunition that they desperately need, they've been very effective in using the Patriot system, more effective than anybody expected them to be. And I think they just need the ammunition. I think when they say that, I think at one meeting they told us, okay, when we were used to fire, we'd have, let's say, 6 incoming targets, we could fire on 6 targets. But we only have 3 rounds to use against 6 targets. We have to pick and choose, and of course 3 are through. So hopefully in the aid package, we will be able to resupply them to the point where they can start covering that gap and leaving some part of the critical infrastructure exposed, and of course the civilian population. And it would be great if we could help them also cover the troops on the front line.
Yeah. This reminds me, Glenn, I want to turn to Manpower now, because we promised we'd hit that for a moment, where the Ukrainians have another, that's one area where, of course, not much a U.S. aid package can do. But I recall, Glenn, you made the point after the trip that one knock-on impact of getting the American aid through was that Ukrainians might be more likely to sign up for the fight if they knew that they're going to have the stuff to fight with. Is that, well, you probably don't know whether we're seeing that yet, but talk about how that came up in your conversations there.
I think in some of the interactions we had, just speaking with Ukrainians, they made it clear that it's very hard to motivate people to go fight when there's no weapons to use or ammunition to use on the front line. That we didn't really have a recruiting problem early on when we had the equipment we needed. And we'll have to see now whether this will help them fill a gap that they've had in terms of, forces to counter the Russians. Hopefully it will. But you bring up another good point, Tom. Some of the problems the Ukrainians are having, we shouldn't just tie it to, the stoppage or the delay in U.S. assistance. The Ukrainians also have some problems in their own training, in the command structure. They also need to get over, in my assessment, they need to move beyond the old Soviet style of thinking in some areas with their commanders. And so, they have work to do to improve their performance on the battlefield. And I think if they do that, and I think they're trying to do it, of course they're fighting a war, so doing it while you're fighting a war is very, very challenging. But if they can do that, and they can, continue to sustain the number of troops, even I would say that they have right now with the weapon systems that are effective, I think they can be successful. They proved that before. I've heard many people, I speak on this issue around the country, and people say, oh, the Russians can't be beat, they're bigger, the Ukrainians can't beat them. In fact, the Ukrainians were beating them. The Ukrainians held their own with them since 2014 in the east, and when the Ukrainians were in a much worse situation. And then, they did launch a very successful counteroffensive, and they can do it again. So we shouldn't just look at the counteroffensive from last year and count that as, the sign of what the Ukrainians are capable of. They're capable of a lot. We just need to arm them to do it.
Paul?
Talk a little bit about something Glenn and I have written about, and it's my pet peeve, but I think it's actually a critical issue, and it has to do with manpower, and it's a policy contradiction. So on one hand, we're encouraging American businesses and American companies to engage with Ukraine, to sell defense armaments to Ukraine, to help with business. But at the same time, we categorize all of Ukraine as a no travel zone. Official State Department guidance say Americans don't go. And we also have extreme restrictions on the numbers of embassy personnel, the numbers of U.S. government personnel, the numbers of CODELs that can be in country at any given time, and even more important, the number of contractors that can be in there working. So if we, you think about Afghanistan and Iraq, how many tens and hundreds of thousands of contractors did we have in there, making sure things worked? Making sure that logistics were in place, repair and maintenance, training, et cetera, et cetera. None of that's there for Ukraine. So if NATO wants to train Ukrainian forces have to leave Ukraine instead of sending NATO trainers in. It's ridiculous. It's absurd.
Well, yeah, and I just wanted to ask, I should know the answer to this, but I don't. What is the reason for that? Is that U.S. policy, NATO policy? Is it a
U.S. policy? And while it's not stated, it's, I think there's two drivers for it. One, I think, is the fear of the political impact of un-American getting killed in Ukraine. There have been no Americans that have been killed in Ukraine in 2 years of war, right? The death toll in Chicago on any given weekend is much greater. The other piece is we're really afraid of escalatory actions, something that will be perceived as provocative to Russia, so that if we send in personnel, that will unleash, a nuclear first strike, which is also absurd. We've allowed Russian brandishing of a nuclear saber, rattling of a nuclear saber, to affect our decision making and to cow us into actions that are not only in effect, ultimately undercut what we're trying to do in terms of helping Ukraine win, but which are contradictory.
I want to ask, I actually thought you were going in this direction, but it's a very different one, and thank you for raising that point, Paul. But a law or a policy that is maybe not contradictory, but difficult, I think, for some Americans to understand in Ukraine, back to the manpower question, is, and I know this happened also while you were on the trip, a bill passed to lower the conscription age, from 27 to 25. And I know from conversations here, a lot of people asked me, well, wait a minute, Ukraine is all in the fight, 1,000%, and yet if you're 27 and under, and now 25 and under, you're not part of the draft. I guess, Ralph, maybe I'll come to you because we've been away from you for a moment. Explain why.
Sure. Yeah.
Why is that policy? What's the history of it, and why is it so controversial to change?
So in the beginning, this was just the Ukrainians trying to protect their youth for the future, right? I mean, we've all heard that the average age at the front is like 43, which is jaw-dropping. It's not like certain American politicians claiming that the Ukrainians are sending their kids to die. They're not. They've been preserving their kids, right? And but Ukraine is not all in. This is part of the difficulty in trying to describe entirely the situation there. I mean, you have a population of 42 million. Really, only about 1 million are directly involved in the war, either fighting or serving in a support capacity or in the government, right? So, the demographics, of course, favor Russia, but in this case, dropping the age from 27 to 25 opened the manpower pool up, but not by much. I mean, really, and this gets to the heart of why the last overall commander of Ukrainian forces, General Valery Zaluzhny, was removed. Right? He wanted general mobilization. He wanted a full conscription. I mean, all Ukrainian young men, I think, from the age of 18 and up, have to register, but they don't serve unless they're 25 or older. And I think the downside to this, aside from limiting the manpower pool, is you get a lot of Ukrainians who say, we're not going to negotiate with the Russians until we take back all our land and get back to the borders of 1991. Well, I think a lot of those people might change their mind if their 19-year-old or 20-year-old kids are being faced with going to the front. It's one thing to say we're not going to negotiate with the Russians when you don't have any skin in the game, but when you have skin in the game, all of a sudden the idea of negotiations, I think, seem a little bit more palatable. So while I sympathize and understand the Ukrainian goal of protecting their kids, I think at the same time there's a political cost here that just makes the situation surrounding negotiations that much more complicated. And I think this is an area where we're going to see increased political discourse and increased political argument on this draft age, on this mobilization issue.
It's interesting because as you're going through that, Ralph, it's one of the only areas, I guess, where you could see Vladimir Putin and Zelensky grappling with a very similar issue, right? Of course, Putin doesn't have to worry too much about opposition, but we know.
And we know Putin's ready to fight to the last, Kalmykian, whereas, the Ukrainians are not ready to fight to the last Ukrainian.
Right. But I guess the question is, if it comes to that, and we don't have to go down this rabbit hole of another big mobilization in Russia that is not only the people in Kalmykia, that might be, well, I hesitate to say problematic for Vladimir Putin because it's hard to know that anything would be, but might be an issue. I don't know if anybody else wants to weigh in on that, or should we move to the next not manpower question? Yeah, Glenn.
I would just say, Tom, demographically, Russia's in, and we shouldn't forget that either. It may be a little bit of a longer term problem for Putin, but his goal, I think 10, 15 years ago, was to increase the population of the Russian population, and it's going back. And so he does have a problem demographically. Russia has a problem demographically, and he has been a big cause of the problem.
Yeah.
Big reason.
Paul, you said something, Paul, during or after the trip last month, that the Ukrainians have to prepare for a, quote, defensive year. That was before, I think, the aid package came through. Do you think that remains the necessary posture for the country at the moment, even with the aid?
Yeah, I do. I think that 2024, as we've seen, will prove to be a year of Ukraine playing defense. But I think that what the aid package means is that they can play defense in a way that significantly degrades the Russian forces, right? So I don't see I don't see Russia wanting to have just static warfare. They want to go on the offensive. They're massing for it. They're building capability for that. But if those offenses are decisively defeated with very high casualty rates and very high attrition of materiel rates, that will significantly improve Ukraine's prospects for A, negotiation on its own terms, and B, reducing or significantly damaging Russia's ability to wage warfare. And I think the war only ends with Russia army defeated on the battlefield. So first part of that is play a good defense, degrade them, tire them out, attrit them, and then use greater capability, greater manpower. Glenn's exactly right. Ultimately need to have more forces in play to defeat Russia on the battlefield, regardless of where the lines are drawn.
Now, speaking of defensives and offensives, there are two areas, maybe more, but two at least, where Ukraine has had some success with offensive asymmetric, I guess is the term we use, activities. One in the Black Sea, and the other with these increasingly, deeper into Russia strikes. That's not a good word, but you know what I mean. Ralph, can you talk a little bit about maybe the second one first? Whatever the U.S. limitations imposed on strikes into Russian territory, the Ukrainians are going ahead. And how important are these? Just irritants, do you think, to the Russians? Or if you're in the Kremlin, how much do you have to worry about these?
Yeah, Tom, these are more than just irritants. These are, I mean, they've already had a heavy impact on Russian oil and gas production, in spite of the complaints of the U.S. administration to knock it off. The Ukrainians have found something that works, and they're not going to just continue it. They're going to double down where they can. So I think, the potential for these attacks to be even more significant on a strategic level is there. Driving the Black Sea fleet away from the Ukrainian shoreline, I think, has done a lot to ensure that Odessa remains safe for the time being, right? I think the strikes on economically important targets or on airfields and all has a morale effect on the Russians that I think can't be underestimated, right? And I think, as far as, red lines, we haven't seen the Russians really respond to these attacks in a way that would suggest that the Ukrainians have crossed the red line. And as we know, the Ukrainians, they'll keep pushing until they do cross a red line. But, my feeling, I remember mentioning this to you guys before, is that a guy like Putin, with all his nuclear saber rattling, I look at him as, this is a guy who is afraid of catching COVID. This is a guy who's afraid of getting sick. And, we've had from report from one of our former colleagues, John Cipher, who talked about if you want to understand Putin and the Russians, talk to the defectors. And there's a consistency from defectors who've talked about Putin's fixation on his health and on his own well-being and on his legacy. And none of that strikes me as characteristics of someone who's ready to, go nuclear. So I think, there's plenty of room still for the Ukrainians to push in these attacks before they hit any kind of red line where the nuclear saber rattling becomes more pronounced.
And Glenn, just back to, well, either one, the Black Sea or the deep strikes. It's hard sometimes to sort of, I appreciate irritants was not a good word to use because it's much more than that, but are they difference makers when put against whatever is happening on the front lines, say in Kharkiv or in the east or whatever? I mean, how should we sort of calibrate the news in one of those places against what's happening in the sort of primary battlefronts?
Well, in terms of the Black Sea, it's opened up the grain corridor. It's opened up exports for the Ukrainians, which has been critical.
Yeah.
And it's put the Russians on their
levels, right?
Yeah.
Back to, yeah.
Yeah. So that's been extremely important and good on the Ukrainians for doing that. In terms of the strikes inside of Russia, what the Ukrainians told us is that they have a specific goal. They're going after aviation fuel. They're going after Russia's ability to supply its air force with the ability to inflict pain on the Ukrainians. It goes back to the discussion we had before. It's maybe the only weapon they have right now to protect against those 300 to 600 sorties a month on the front lines, or against attacks against the Ukrainian forces on the front lines. So it's calculated, and I agree with Ralph. I mean, it's very hard to imagine what red line could they, what is the punishment that Putin's going to do? Bomb schools, attack Kiev, blow up historic monuments, kill old people, send prisoners, over 100,000 convicts into Ukraine to rape people, kidnap children. I mean, he's done all of that. So what the Ukrainians are doing, I personally, I think it's absurd to say that there's a risk that he's crossing a red line. So that's my view, and I hope that they continue. They've been very successful, and again, good on them. They've shown a lot of ingenuity and courage in what they've done.
I think that these attacks also have to be looked at in context of sanctions, right? So for 2 years, we've had sanctions regime that were designed to reduce the revenues at its core, to reduce the revenues flowing into the Russian war machine, right? To put caps on oil prices and to make it more, and to raise costs of production. So these strikes, I think, are a fantastic complement to sanctions. One, if you burn a barrel of oil at the source, that's a barrel that's not going to be bought by India or China. And every barrel of refined product that gets burned or not produced means the equivalent of $100 or so that's not going into the Russian war machine. So I think these are critical attacks, both for the physical impact, the revenue impact, and for the morale impact.
We have some other questions coming in, and we go back to the where we started in a way. Adam Blanco wants to know, what about Gerasimov in the context of our conversation earlier about Messrs. Shoigu and Patrushev and all the others. So that's Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff. And Adam's question is, isn't he really the key player here in terms of battlefield command? Anybody want to raise their hand for that?
I would just say that there's some initial assessment coming out of, let's say, experts inside of Russia saying that this will just strengthen his position, that Belousov will not have as much influence as even Shoigu had. Shoigu was a big player in the cabinet. And so it probably will strengthen his hand. I tend to agree with that.
There's also a question, and I assume the answer to this is no, but one should never assume. This is from James Justin. Whether the recent, he calls it equivocation in weapon support for one of our closest allies, Israel, the issue of holding back some ordnance because of Netanyahu's push into Rafah, whether that could affect the Ukraine-Russia situation. Ralph?
Yeah, I mean, on that one, Tom, I mean, you have to take into account that this is, you know, the equivocation on holdback weapons has to deal with a very specific front, and that is the, Gaza. Whereas you look just a few weeks ago when, the Iranians launched their highly telegraphed cruise missile, drone attack on Israel. I mean, CENTCOM, amongst other partners, stepped up, and there are reports that up to a third of the projectiles that were launched at Israel were taken out by U.S. CENTCOM forces and allies. So, there aren't any real lessons to be taken there. I think that's mostly just political bluster. I think the Ukrainians have already had to deal with, the political theater that has, become Congress. And while they're grateful for what they've received in this, in the passage of the most recent bill, they know that, as Glenn and Paul mentioned earlier, we're going to be going back down the same road in a few months when it's time to formulate the next aid package for Ukraine. So, I really don't think there are any lessons to be taken from the Israel-Gaza offensive, but more concerns have to be put, and the administration has to put a lot more attention onto how do they sell the message so that the next round of aid doesn't face the same level of hostility as the last round.
Mm-hmm. I want to come back to that, some closing thoughts in a minute, but before we do, since we just left Ukraine sort of for a moment to go to the Middle East, I want to leave to go to another place because it's relevant, and since we didn't talk about this before, just raise your hand if you want to answer, and that's Georgia, as in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. So we don't have to get into the weeds of this, but there's a law that's being pushed ahead there that is seen as a very pro-Russian measure, and it has drawn a huge number of protesters to the streets and a lot of comparisons by some commentators inside and outside that country. We don't want Russia in here any more than the Ukrainians want Russia in their country. How significant, if significant, are those developments, and are they part and parcel of the bigger picture? How much the Georgians should be nervous, so on and so forth? I hope after that long-winded question, somebody will answer.
Well, I'll jump in and say I think it's significant. Georgia's going through a very difficult time. I think, what you're dealing with is Putinism, and the Georgian people are making it very clear they don't want that. They're against it. What the U.S. policy will be and how we will support those, the Georgian people is very important. And I'm going to take the opportunity while I'm here, Tom, to slide over to Armenia. There's very interesting and important developments happening there, which we should be paying attention to. The Prime Minister has shown an incredible amount of courage in trying to come to a peace agreement with Azerbaijan and through Azerbaijan, Turkey. And he's facing a lot of opposition and Russian meddling and threats to his leadership. And it's another country which we cannot let Pashinyan fall. We cannot let him go and become a victim to what Russia is going to want to do and been trying to do to him. It's absolutely critical that we support him because he has done a really brave, in my opinion, thing in agreeing to let Nagorno-Karabakh stay with Azerbaijan and giving up some recent, he made some more concessions recently to try and get to a peace agreement, which will ultimately open the border between Armenia and Turkey and benefit the Armenian people. We need to make Armenia a symbol. I said this before about Ukraine, also like a West Berlin in that region. And I'm sorry to talk, go away from Georgia because it's also very important, but I want to make sure Americans are focusing on what's happening in Armenia.
Yeah. Anybody else before we wrap on? Yeah, Paul.
For me, the meaning of Georgia is that we can't be looking at these issues in isolation. They're all linked, right? And ultimately, they're all linked to what I see as the modern axis of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And most of the issues we're grappling with end up being sourced back to those capitals. And absolutely, Russia is looking at Azerbaijan, at Kazakhstan, at pressure, at Belarus, at pressure on the Baltics, et cetera. These are all part of a larger plan, larger strategy of undermining the U.S., weakening the U.S., weakening the West, dividing us, confusing us, so that we're paralyzed with inaction.
But in the case of Georgia, In the case of Georgia, is it not, at least also for the moment, just for the moment, a case of a rising up against all that, to use Glenn's term,
You do.
Putinism?
I mean, you see, I mean, the Georgian Dream government, so-called Georgian Dream, it's the upward has shown its spots. You know that it is a pro-Russian government that's following models that Putin has put into place and is looking to gradually add repression onto the people. And they're reacting against that.
Yep.
And worth noting that the Georgians took up arms against their oppressors in the past, in the 90s, and if pushed hard enough, they'll do it again.
Yep. I was actually there back then, but that's for another time. Yes, Glenn.
I just want to say, Paul makes a great point. We cannot look at these issues like one by one. That's not the way that our enemies are looking at it. Going back to the issue of Israel and what's happening, we have to be very aware that Putin continues to benefit with what's happening in the Middle East. Iran is still a big factor. The number of Iranian drones that were used against Ukraine have doubled in, I think, the last 6 months. It's just a statistic I saw. And I would argue that our policy towards Israel, we need to continue to show that we are lockstep behind the Israelis, because the Russians are looking for us to show weakness
Right.
with the Israelis, and they're going to use that against us. And it's all one big problem. I've said this before. I hate to say it, but we're at war with not just Russia. We're at war with Iran right now, and a lot of the proxies that the Iranians have on their payroll. And we should stand with those allies that are fighting against those proxies. In my
Vacillation is the road to perdition.
I was going to say that. Hey,
We have 6 minutes that remain, and maybe we could just do one quick question that I'll just ask each of you. It's a very general one, but you've put so much interesting stuff on the table for us to think about, and we've been talking about necessarily things that have happened in the rearview mirror. Looking ahead, and not asking you to forecast things, but just in terms of things that you are watching for, looking at, and therefore what the rest of us in our audience ought to be watching for and looking at in terms of Ukraine. I'll start with Ralph. What are the key things that, say in the weeks, months, or just rest of this year that you'll be looking at?
Well, since Glenn and Paul have made a great point of not looking at any of this stuff in isolation, I would say look towards big changes in the Middle East in terms of how the powers align there. You've got Saudi Arabia is still looking to find a way to partner with the Israelis, right, to counter the Iranian threat. You've got the centuries-old Shia-Sunni Arab-Persia conflict looming over all this in the background. So even with everything that's going on in Gaza, people are still trying to look beyond that. And once again, I'll use this opportunity to proselytize. The only thing that's going to make any difference out there is regime change in Tehran. Right? So I think that realization is starting to settle across the region and the different governments there. So we may see some work in that arena. As far as Ukraine and Russia goes, it's all on the battlefield, and no political settlement is going to be possible until one side or the other feels, until both sides rather feel it's in their best interest to negotiate. So, it remains for each side to figure out what that means. And it's still, the onus is on our own administration here to clearly enunciate what the policy is going forward, so that once we do face the next round of negotiations for the next aid package, there's got to be a clear policy goal there. So those are the things I'm looking at.
Paul, Ukraine, Russia, where will your attention be in the next few months?
So I think one thing to look ahead is the NATO summit in Washington this summer. Ukraine is going to be looking for some sign of commitment. I think the politics around it are unfortunately not going to lead to the firm language that I would like to see. I believe that the war won't end for good until Ukraine is in NATO or has the equivalent of 38,000 troops on the 38th parallel. and I think so that the NATO summit and how we deal with building consensus for what real security guarantees for Ukraine following the end of fighting is sort of critical next step.
Thank you, Paul. Glenn, we'll give you the last word. What are you looking at?
Political unity in Kiev, in Ukraine, how Zelensky is able to maintain the kind of unity that I think he needs to continue to fight this war, with the Russians very actively trying to split that nation. And also to the NATO summit, I would say I'm very interested to see if the Turkish president comes to that summit. We should not forget he just canceled the trip here. Was supposed to be here last week. He canceled it. It's not exactly clear why, but there's some indication that it has to do with Gaza and U.S. policy. And we've got to watch that. I'm sure the Russians are smacking their lips right now that he did not come. And we want to make sure that we don't lose the second largest standing military in NATO, which is an important partner and controls the straits. So we want to make sure that that relationship remains healthy. So I'm very interested to see if he comes here in July.
That's a really good point, and another example of the point you've both made, or all of you've made in one way or another. All these things are interconnected. Glenn Corn, Paul Kolbe, Ralph Goff, really appreciate your time, your insights. I always learn a lot. Our audience does too. And to the audience, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time here at the Cipher Brief. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, everybody.